Great Hall Productions presents The Lion of the North, a tale of the times of Gustavus Adolphus by G. A. Henty. Read and produced by Jim Weiss. Copyright 2008 by Great Hall Productions. Preface by G. A. Henty. My dear lads, you are nowadays called upon to acquire so great a mass of learning and information in the period of life between the ages of 12 and 18 that it is not surprising that but little time can be spared for the study of the history of foreign nations. Most lads are, therefore, lamentably ignorant of the leading events of even the most important epochs of continental history, although, as many of these events have exercised a marked influence upon the existing state of affairs in Europe, a knowledge of them is far more useful, and it may be said far more interesting, than that of the comparatively petty affairs of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes. Prominent among such epochs is the 30 Years' War, which arose from the determination of the Emperor of Austria to crush out Protestantism throughout Germany. Since the invasion of the Huns, no struggle which has taken place in Europe has approached this in the obstinacy of the fighting and the terrible sufferings which the war inflicted upon the people at large. During these 30 years, the population of Germany decreased by nearly a third, and in some of the states, half the towns and 2/3 of the villages absolutely disappeared. The story of the 30 Years' War is too long to be treated in one volume. Fortunately, it divides itself naturally into two parts. The first begins with the entry of Sweden under her chivalrous monarch, Gustavus Adolphus, and terminates with his death and that of his great rival, Wallenstein. This portion of the war has been treated in the present story. The second period begins at the point when France assumed the leading part in the struggle, and concluded with the peace which secured liberty of conscience to the Protestants of Germany. This period I hope to treat someday in another story, so that you may have a complete picture of the war. The military events of the present tale, the battles, sieges, and operations, are all taken from the best authorities, while for the account of the special doings of Mackay's, afterwards Monro's, Scottish regiment, I am indebted to Mr. J. Grant's Life of Sir John Hepburn. Yours sincerely, G. A. Henty. Chapter 1. The Invitation. It was late in the afternoon in the spring of the year 1630. The hilltops of the south of Scotland were covered with masses of cloud. A fierce wind swept the driving rain before it with such force that it was not easy to make way against it. It had been raining for 3 days without intermission. Every little mountain burn had become a boiling torrent, while the rivers had risen above their banks and flooded the lowlands in the valleys. The shades of evening were closing in when a lad of some 16 years of age stood gazing across the swollen waters of the Nith rushing past in turbid flood. With his lowland bonnet pressed down over his eyes and his plaid wrapped tightly round him, he stood on a rising hummock of ground at the edge of the flood. "If they are not here soon," he said to himself, "they will not get across the Nith tonight. None but bold riders could do so now, but by what Uncle says, Captain Hugh must be that and more. Ah, here they come." As he spoke, 2 horsemen rode down the opposite side of the valley and halted at the water's edge. The prospect was not a pleasant one. The river was 60 or 70 feet wide, and in the center, the water swept along in a raging current. "You cannot cross here," the boy shouted at the top of his voice. "You must go higher up." The wind swept his words away, but his gestures were understood. "The boy is telling us to go higher up," said one of the horsemen. "I suppose he is," the other replied. "But here is the ford. The road we have traveled ends here, and I can see it again on the other side. It is getting dark, and were we to cross higher up, we might lose our way. It is years since I was here." The lad, seeing the hesitation of the horsemen, ran along the bank up the stream, and to their surprise, when he had gone a little more than 100 yards, dashed into the water. He waded out until he reached the edge of the regular bank of the river and then swam out into the current. "Go back!" a horseman shouted, but his voice did not reach the swimmer, who was in the full force of the stream and soon was lost to sight. "The boy'll be drowned," one of the horsemen said, spurring his horse up the valley. But in another minute, the lad was seen breasting the calmer water just above the ford. "You cannot cross here, Captain Hume," he said as he approached the horseman. "You must go nigh a mile up the river." "Who are you, lad, and how do you know my name?" "I am the nephew of Nigel Graham. Seeing how deep the floods were, I came out to show you the way, for the best horse in the world could not swim the Nith here now. But this is the ford." "Yes, in dry weather. The bottom here is hard rock, and easy to ride over when the river's but waist deep. But the water is 6 feet deep here now, and the horses would be carried down among the rocks and would never get across. A mile up the river, there is nothing to prevent a bold horseman from swimming across." "I thank you heartily, young sir. I doubt not that it would have fared hard with us had we attempted to swim across here. Munro, we have had a narrow escape."
"Aye,"
the Highlander agreed.
"It would have been hard if you and I, after going through all the battlefields of the Low Countries, should have been drowned in a Scottish burn. Your young friend's a gallant lad, Hume, for it was no light task to swim that torrent with the water as cold as ice."
"Now, sirs," the boy said, "will you please ride on? It is getting dark, and the sooner we are across, the better." So saying, he went off at a fast run, the horses trotting behind him. A mile above, he reached the spot he had spoken of. "Now, if you take the water, you will get across," the boy said. He plunged into the stream, swimming quietly and steadily across, and allowing the stream to drift him down. The horsemen followed his example. They had swum many a swollen river, and although their horses snorted and plunged at first, they soon quieted down and swam steadily over. They just struck the spot which the boy had indicated. He had already arrived there, and without a word, trotted forward. It was soon dark, and the horsemen were obliged to keep close to his heels to see his figure. The ground was rough and broken, and Colonel Munro said to his companion,
"'Tis well we have a guide, for even had we got safely across the stream, we should never have found our way across such a country as this, especially on such a night. Scotland is a fine country, Hume, but as for the weather this time of year, 'tis only fit for a water rat."
Hume laughed at this outburst. "I shan't be sorry, Munro, for a change of dry clothes and a corner by a fire, but we must be nearly there now. Graham's Hold is about 3 miles from the Nith." A minute later, lights were seen ahead, and in 2 or 3 minutes the horsemen drew up at a door beside which 2 men were standing with torches. Another strolled out as they stopped.
"Welcome, Hume. And is it you, Munro? It is long indeed since we met." "That it is, Graham. 12 years since we were students at St. Andrews."
"I did not think you would come on such a night." "I doubt we should have come tonight or any other night if it had not been that that brave boy who calls you uncle swam across the Nith to show us the way. We owe him our lives."
"It would have gone hard with you indeed had you tried to swim at the ford. Had I not made so sure you would not come, I would have sent a man down there. I missed Malcolm after dinner, and wondered what had become of him. But come in and get your wet things off. It is a cold welcome keeping you here. My men will take your horses round to the stable and see that they are well rubbed down and warmly littered."
In a quarter of an hour, the party were assembled again in the sitting room. It was a bare room, with heavily timbered ceiling and narrow windows high up from the ground, for the house was built for purposes of defense, like most Scottish residences in those days. The floor was thickly strewn with rushes. Arms and trophies of the chase hung on the walls, and a bright fire blazing on the hearth gave it a warm and cheerful aspect. As his guests entered the room, Graham presented them with a large silver cup of steaming liquor.
"I will warrant me a draught of spiced wine will drive the cold of the Nith out of your bones."
The travelers drank off the liquor. "The cold here seems to have a knack of getting into one's very marrow. Well, how goes it with you, Graham?"
"Times in Scotland have been getting worse and worse since King James went to England, and all the court with him. If it were not for an occasional raid among the wild folks of Galloway, and a few quarrels among ourselves, life would be too dull to bear here."
"But why bear it?" Captain Hume asked.
I wonder at your rusting your life out here, when there is a fair field and plenty of honor, to say nothing of hard cash, to be won in the Low Country. Why, beside Hepburn's regiment, which has made itself a name throughout all Europe, there are 50 of Scottish regiments in the service of the King of Sweden, and His Majesty Gustavus Adolphus does not keep them idle, I warrant you. Graham said, I have all along intended to cross the seas when Malcolm came of an age to take charge of his father's lands. When my brother James was dying, I promised him I would be a father to the boy and see that he got his rights. Well, we will talk of the affair after supper, Graham, for now that I have got rid of the cold, I begin to perceive that I am well nigh famished. Supper was soon brought in. After ample justice had been done to this, and the board was again cleared, the 3 men drew their seats round the fire, Malcolm seating himself on a low stool by his uncle. And now to business, Nigel, Colonel Munro said. We have not come back to Scotland to see the country, or to enjoy the weather, or even for the pleasure of swimming rivers in flood. We are commissioned by the King of Sweden to raise some 3,000 or 4,000 more Scottish troops. I believe that the King intends to take part in the war in Germany, where the Protestants are getting terribly mauled, and where, indeed, it is likely that the Reformed religion will be stamped out altogether unless the Swedes strike in to their rescue. My chief object is to fill up to its full strength of 2,000 men, the Mackay Regiment, of which I am lieutenant colonel. The rest of the recruits will go as drafts to fill up the vacancies in the other regiments. It is our intention to see all our friends and relations, and ask each to raise a company or half a company of recruits, of which, of course, they would have the command. Scott of Jedburgh has engaged to raise a company. Belfer of Lauderdale, who's a cousin of mine, has promised to bring another. Young Hamilton, who'd been an ensign in my regiment, left us on the way, and he will raise a company in Douglasdale. Now, Graham, don't you think you can bring us a band of the men of Nithsdale? I don't think I can manage it. Nonsense, said Hume. Are you thinking of the lad here? Why not bring him with you? He is young, certainly, but as for his spirit, Munro and I will vouch for it. Oh, do, uncle, the lad exclaimed. I promise I would not give you any trouble. And as for marching, there isn't a man in Nithsdale who can tire me out across the mountains. But what's to become of the house, Malcolm, and the land, and the herds? Leave old Duncan in charge. He will look after them. But I had intended you to go to St. Andrews next year. Malcolm's face fell. Take the lad with you, Graham, Colonel Munro said. 3 years under Gustavus will do him vastly more good than will St. Andrews. You know, it never did us any good. We learned a little Latin, but I don't know that has been of any use to us. And as for the dry tomes of divinity we waded through, I am happy to say not a single word remains in my brain. The boy will see life. He will have opportunities of distinguishing himself under the eye of the most chivalrous king in Europe, and a fair chance of bettering his fortune. Graham said, It is a serious step to take. I will think it over by the morning. Tell me a little more about the merits of this quarrel in Germany. If I am going to fight, I should like at least to know exactly what I am fighting about. Hume laughed. You will never make a soldier if you always want to know the ins and outs of every quarrel you have to fight about. But for once, the tenderest conscience may be satisfied as to the justice of the contention. But Munro is much better versed in the history of the affair than I am. Some 20 years ago, Colonel Munro began, the Protestant princes of Germany formed a league for mutual protection and support, which they called the Protestant Union. A year later, the Catholics on their side constituted what they called the Holy League. At that time, the condition of the Protestants was not unbearable. In Bohemia, where they constituted 2/3 of the population, Rudolph II, and after him, Matthias, gave conditions of religious freedom. Gradually, however, the Catholic party about the emperor gained the upper hand. Then various acts in breach of the conditions granted to the Protestants were committed, and public spirit on both sides became much embittered. In May of 1618, the estates of Bohemia met at Prague, and the Protestant nobles, headed by Count Thurn, came there armed, and demanded from the imperial councillors an account of the high-handed proceedings. A violent quarrel ensued. Finally, the Protestant deputies seized the councillors and hurled them from the window into the dry ditch 50 feet below. Fortunately for the councillors,
The ditch contained a quantity of light rubbish, and they escaped without serious damage. The incident was the commencement of war. The Protestant Union supported Bohemia in its action. Matthias, a tolerant and well-meaning man, tried to allay the storm, but failing to do so, marched an army into Bohemia. Had Matthias lived, matters would probably have arranged themselves, but he died the following spring, and he was succeeded by Ferdinand II, who had taken a solemn vow that if ever he came to the throne, he'd re-establish Catholicism throughout his dominions. The Catholic princes and representatives met at Frankfurt and elected Ferdinand Emperor of Germany. He at once entered into a strict agreement with Maximilian of Bavaria to crush Protestantism throughout Germany. The religious freedom granted by Matthias was abolished. All members of the Calvinistic sect were forced to leave their country. A few months afterwards, the Lutherans were also expelled, and in 1627, the exercise of all religious forms except those of the Catholic Church was forbidden. 200 of the noble and 30,000 of the wealthier and industrial classes were driven into exile, and lands and property to the amount of 5 or 6 million pounds were confiscated. The Protestant princes, thoroughly alarmed, besought aid from the Protestant countries, England, Holland, and Denmark. England agreed to supply an annual subsidy. Holland consented to supply troops, and the King of Denmark joined the League and was to take command of the army. In Germany, the Protestants of Lower Saxony and Brunswick and the partisan leader Mansfeld were still in arms. The army under the King of Denmark advanced into Brunswick and was there confronted by that of the Catholic League under General Tilly, while an Austrian army raised by Wallenstein also marched against it. Mansfeld endeavored to prevent Wallenstein from joining Tilly, but was met and defeated. Mansfeld disbanded his remaining soldiers, and 2 months afterwards he died. Wallenstein then marched north. It was decided that Tilly should carry the war into Holland, and that Wallenstein should deal with the King of Denmark and the Protestant princes. In the course of 2 years, he drove the Danes from Silesia, subdued Brandenburg and Mecklenburg, and besieged Stralsund. The Protestants throughout Germany were required to restore to the Catholics all the monasteries and land which had formerly belonged to the Catholic Church. The Catholic service was alone to be performed, and the Catholic princes of the empire were ordered to constrain their subjects, by force if necessary, to conform to the Catholic faith, and it was intimated to the Protestant princes that they would be equally forced to carry the edict into effect. But this was too much. Even France disapproved, not from any feeling of pity for the Protestants on the part of Cardinal Richelieu, the French Prime Minister, but because it did not suit the interests of France that Ferdinand should become the absolute monarch of all Germany. In these circumstances, Gustavus of Sweden resolved to assist the Protestants in arms, and that is what has brought us here. Already in the Swedish army there are 10,000 Scotchmen, and in Denmark they also form the backbone of the force. And both in the Swedish and Danish armies, the greater part of the native troops are officered and commanded by Scotchmen. I myself have been in the Danish service, but my regiment's about to take service with the Swedes, and I need 500 men to fill up my ranks to the full strength. Now, Graham, I quite rely upon you. You were at college with Hepburn, Hume, and myself, and it'll be a pleasure for us all to fight side by side. And if I know anything of your disposition, I am sure you cannot be contented to remain here, while Hepburn's already won a name which is known through Europe. Chapter 2. Shipwrecked. The following morning, Nigel Graham told his visitors that he had determined to accept their offer, and would at once set to work to raise a company. I have, he said, a small patrimony of my own, and as for the last 8 years I've been living here looking after Malcolm, I have been laying by any rents, and can now furnish arms and accoutrements for 100 men. When Malcolm comes of age, he must act for himself, and can raise 200 or 300 men if he chooses, but at present he will march in my company. I understand that I have the appointment of my own officers. Yes, until you join the regiment, Monroe said. You have the first appointments. Afterwards, the colonel will fill up vacancies. You must decide how you'll arm your men, for you must know that Gustavus's regiments have their right and left wings composed of musketeers, while the center is formed of pikemen. You decide to which branch your company shall belong.
I would choose the pike, for after all it must be by the pike that the battle is decided.
Quite right, Nigel. I have here with me a drawing of the armor in use with us. You see they have helmets of an acorn shape with a rim turning up in front, gauntlets, buff coats well padded in front, and large breastplates. The pikes vary from 14 to 18 feet long, according to the taste of the commander. We generally use about 16. If your company is 100 strong, you'll have 2 lieutenants and 3 ensigns. I'll fill in the king's commission to you as captain of the company, authorizing you to enlist men for his service and to appoint officers thereto.
An hour or two later, Colonel Munro and Captain Hume proceeded on their way. The news speedily spread through Nithsdale that Nigel Graham had received a commission from the King of Sweden to raise a company in his service, and very speedily men began to pour in. The disbandment of the Scottish army, after King James of Scotland had added the English crown and become James I of the United Kingdom, had left few careers open at home to the youth of that country. Very large numbers had consequently flocked to the continent and taken service in one or other of the armies there. Consequently, in 48 hours, Nigel Graham had applications from a far larger number than he could accept, and he was enabled to pick and choose among the applicants. Many young men of good family were among them, for in those days, service in the ranks was regarded as honorable, and great numbers of young men of good family and education trailed a pike in the Scotch regiments in the service of various powers of Europe. 2 young men whose property adjoined his own, Herries and Farquhar, each of whom brought 20 of his own tenants with him, were appointed lieutenants. 2 others, Leslie and Jameson, were, with Malcolm, named as ensigns, while the non-commissioned officers were men who had served before. Many of the men already possessed armor which was suitable, for in those days there was no strict uniformity of military attire. Colonel Munro returned in the course of a fortnight, Nigel Graham's company completing the ranks of his regiment. He stopped for a week in Nithsdale, giving instructions to the officers and non-commissioned officers as to the drill in use in the Swedish army. Military maneuvers were in those days very different to what they have now become. The movements were few, simple, easily acquired. Gustavus had, however, introduced an entirely new formation into his army. Hitherto, troops had fought in solid masses, 20 or more deep. Gustavus taught his men to fight 6 deep, maintaining that if troops were steady, this depth of formation should be able to sustain any assault upon it, and that with a greater depth, the men behind were useless in the fight. His cavalry fought only 3 deep. The recruits acquired the new tactics with little difficulty. In Scotland, for generations, every man and boy had received military training. At the end of a week, Colonel Munro pronounced Nigel Graham's company capable of taking their place in the regiment without discredit, and so went forward to see to the training of the companies of Hamilton, Balfour, and Scott, having arranged with Graham to march his company to Dunbar in 3 weeks' time, when he would be joined by the other 3 companies. Malcolm was delighted with the stir and bustle of his new life. Accustomed to hard exercise, climbing and swimming, he was a strong and well-grown lad, and was in appearance fully a year beyond his age. He felt but little fatigued by the incessant drill in which the days were passed, though he was glad enough of an evening to lay aside his armor, of which the officers wore in those days considerably more than the soldiers, the mounted officers being still clad in full armor, while those on foot wore back and arm pieces, and often leg pieces, in addition to the helmet and breastplate. They were armed with swords and pistols, and carried besides what were called half-pikes, pikes some 7 feet long. They wore feathers in their helmets, and the armor was of fine quality, often richly damascened or inlaid with gold. Very proud did Malcolm feel as, on the appointed day, he marched with the company from Nithsdale, with the sun glittering on their arms, and a drummer beating the march at their head. They arrived in due course at Dunbar, and were joined by the other 3 companies under Munro himself. They embarked at once on board a ship which Munro had chartered, and were landed in Denmark and marched to Flensburg, where the rest of the regiment was lying. A fortnight was spent in severe drill. Then orders were received from Oxenstiern, the Chancellor of Sweden, to embark the regiment on board 2 Swedish vessels, the Lily Nickel and the Hound. The baggage horses and ammunition were in a smaller vessel. The orders were that they were to land on the southern shore of the Baltic. Scarcely had they set sail than the weather changed, and a sudden tempest burst upon them. Higher and higher grew the wind, and the vessels were separated in the night. The Lily Nickel labored heavily in the waves, and the discomfort of the troops, crowded together between decks, was very great. Presently it was discovered that she had made a leak and that the water was entering fast. Monroe at once called 48 soldiers to the pumps. They were relieved every quarter of an hour, and by dint of the greatest exertions, barely succeeded in keeping down the water. So heavily did the vessel labor that Monroe bore away for Danzig. But when night came on, the storm increased in fury. They were now in shoal water, and the vessel, already half waterlogged, became quite unmanageable in the furious waves. Beyond the fact that they were fast driving onto the Pomeranian coast, they were ignorant of their position. "This is a rough beginning," Nigel said to his nephew. Before Malcolm had time to answer, there was a tremendous crash which threw them off their feet. All below struggled on deck, but nothing could be seen in the darkness save masses of foam as the waves broke on the rock on which they had struck. There were 2 more crashes, even louder and more terrible, and the vessel broke in 2 parts. "Come aft, all!" Colonel Monroe shouted. "This part of the wreck is fixed." With great efforts, all on board managed to reach the after portion of the vessel, which was wedged among the rocks. Soon afterwards, the forepart broke up and disappeared. For 2 hours, the sea broke wildly over the ship, and all had to hold on for life. Malcolm, even in this time of danger, could not but admire the calmness and coolness of his young colonel, who at once set men to work with ropes to drag towards the vessel the floating pieces of wreck which were tossing about in the boiling surf. The masts and yards were hauled alongside, and the colonel instructed the men to make themselves fast to these in case the vessel should go to pieces. Hour after hour passed. At last, to the joy of all, daylight appeared. The boats had all been broken to pieces, and Monroe now set the men to work to bind the spars and timbers together into a raft. One of the soldiers and a sailor volunteered to try to swim to shore with lines, but both were dashed to pieces. At 1 o'clock in the day, some natives were seen collecting on the shore, and these presently dragged down a boat and launched it, and with great difficulty rowed out to the ship. A line was thrown to them, and with this they returned to shore, where they made the line fast. The storm was now abating somewhat, and Monroe ordered the debarkation to commence. As many of the troops as could find a place on the raft, or could cling to the ropes fastened on its sides, started first, and by means of the line, hauled the raft to shore. A small party then brought it back to the ship, while others manned the boat. And so, after a number of trips, the whole of the troops and crew were landed, together with all the weapons and armor that could be saved. From the peasantry, Monroe now learned that they had been wrecked upon the coast of Rügenwalde, a low-lying tract of country in the north of Pomerania. The forts upon it were all in the possession of Catholic imperialists, while the nearest post of the Protestant Swedes was 80 miles away. The position was not a pleasant one. Many of the arms had been lost, and the gunpowder was of course destroyed. The men were worn out with their long struggle with the tempest. They were without food, and might at any moment be attacked by enemies. Monroe said, "Before night we can do nothing. We must hope that the Germans will not discover us till then." Thereupon he ordered all the men to lie down under shelter of the bushes on the slopes facing the shore, and on no account to show themselves on the higher ground. Then he sent a Walloon officer of the regiment to the Pomeranian seneschal of the old castle of Rügenwalde, which belonged to Bogislaus IV., Duke of Pomerania, to inform him that a body of Scotch troops in the service of the Swedish king had been cast on his coast, and begging him to supply them with a few muskets, some dry powder, and bullets, promising, if he would do so, that the Scotch would clear the town of its imperial garrison. The castle itself, which was a very old feudal building, was held only by the retainers of the Duke, and the seneschal at once complied with Monroe's request. For the Duke of Pomerania, his master, although nominally an ally of the Imperialists, had been deprived of all authority by them, and the feeling of his subjects were entirely with the Swedes. 50 old muskets, some ammunition, and some food were sent out by a secret passage to the Scots. There was great satisfaction among the men when these supplies arrived. The muskets which had been brought ashore were cleaned up and loaded, and the feeling that they were no longer in a position to fall helplessly into the hands of any foe who might discover them restored the spirits of the troops. At nightfall, led by the men who had brought the arms, they passed by the secret passage into the castle, and thence sallied suddenly into the town below. There they fell upon a patrol of imperial cavalry, who were all shot down before they had time to draw their swords. Then, scattering through the town, Monroe's soldiers saw to it that the whole squadron who garrisoned it were either killed or taken prisoner. This easy conquest achieved, the first care of Monroe was to feed his troops. These were then armed from the stores in the town, and a strong guard being placed, lest they be attacked by the Austrian force, which was, they learned, lying but 7 miles away on the other side of the river, the troops lay down to snatch a few hours of much-needed rest. In the morning, the main body advanced and blew up the bridge across the river. 5 days later, an order came from Oxenstiern, to whom Monroe had at once dispatched the news of his capture of Rügenwalde, ordering him to hold it to the last, the position being very valuable as an entrance into Pomerania. The passage of the river was protected by entrenchments. Strong redoubts were thrown up round Rügenwalde, and parties crossing the river in boats collected provisions and stores from the country to the very gates of Danzig. The Austrians rapidly closed in upon all sides, and for 9 weeks a constant series of skirmishes were maintained with them. At the end of that time, Sir John Hepburn arrived from Spruce, having pushed forward by order of Oxenstiern to their relief. Loud and hearty was the cheering when the 2 Scotch regiments united and the friends, Monroe and Hepburn, clasped hands. Not only had they been at college together, but they had, after leaving St. Andrews, traveled in companionship on the continent for 2 or 3 years before taking service. "I have another old friend in my regiment, Hepburn," the colonel said after the first greeting was over. "Nigel Graham." "Right glad'll I be to see him again," Hepburn exclaimed cordially. "But I thought your regiment was entirely from the north." "It was originally, but I've filled up the gaps with men from Nithsdale and the south. And the other companies are all commanded by men who were with us at St. Andrews." "That is well," Hepburn said. "Whether from the north or the south, Scots fight well, and with Gustavus, 'tis like being in our own country. So large a proportion are we of His Majesty's army. And now, Monroe, I fear that I must supersede you in command, being senior to you in the service, and having moreover His Majesty's commission as governor of the town and district." There were many officers in both regiments who were old friends and acquaintances, and there was much feasting that night in the Scotch camp. In the morning, work began again. The peasants of the district, 8,000 strong, were mustered, divided into companies, and armed. With these and the 2 Scotch regiments, Hepburn advanced through Pomerania to the gates of Kolberg, 50 miles away, clearing the country of the Austrians, who offered but faint resistance. The Lord of Kniphausen, a general in the Swedish service, now arrived with some Swedish troops and prepared to besiege the town. Monroe's regiment was ordered to aid in the investment of Kolberg, while Hepburn was to seize a town and castle 5 miles distant, there to check the advance of the Imperialists, who were moving forward in strength towards it. Hepburn performed his mission with a party of cavalry, and reported that, although the castle was dilapidated, it was a place of strength, and could be held by a resolute garrison. Whereupon, Monroe, with 500 men of his regiment, was ordered to occupy it. Nigel Graham's company was one of those which marched forward on the 6th of November, and entering the town, which was almost deserted by its inhabitants, set to work to prepare it for defense. Ramparts of earth and stockades were hastily thrown up, and the gates were backed by piles of rubbish to prevent them being blown in by petards. Scarcely were the preparations completed before the enemy were seen moving down the hillside. "How many are there, think you?" Malcolm asked Lieutenant Farquhar. "I should say that there must be fully 5,000. Monroe's orders were to hold the town as long as he could, and afterwards to defend the castle to the last man. The imperial general sent in a message requesting him to treat for the surrender of the place, but Monroe replied simply that, as no allusion to the word treaty was contained in his instructions, he should defend the place to the last. The first advance of the Imperialists was made by the cavalry, covered by 1,000 musketeers, but these were repulsed without much difficulty by the Scottish fire. The whole force then advanced to the attack with great resolution. Desperately the Highlanders defended the town. Again and again the Imperialists were repulsed from the slight rampart, and when at last they won their way into the place by dint of numbers, every street, lane, alley, and house was defended to the last. Malcolm was almost bewildered by the din, the incessant roll of musketry, the hoarse shouts of the contending troops, the rattling of the guns, the shrieks of pain. Every time the Imperialists tried to force their way in heavy columns up the streets, the Scots poured out from the houses to resist them, and meeting them pike to pike, hurled them backwards. Malcolm tried to keep cool and to imitate the behavior of his senior officers, repeating their orders and seeing that they were carried out. Time after time, the Austrians attempted to carry the place and were hurled back, although outnumbering the Scots by nigh 20-1. At last, the town was in ruins and was on fire in a score of places. Its streets and lanes were heaped with dead, and it was no longer tenable. Monroe therefore gave orders that the houses should everywhere be set on fire and the troops fall back to the castle. Steadily, in good order, his commands were carried out. With leveled pikes still facing the enemy, the troops retired into the castle. The imperial general, seeing how heavy had been his losses in carrying the open town, shrank from the prospect of assaulting a castle defended by such troops. When night fell, he quietly marched away with the force under his command. Chapter 3. Sir John Hepburn. Monroe's first care, when he found that the Imperialists had retreated in the direction of Coburg, was to send out horsemen to discover whether the Swedes were in position to cover that town. The men returned in 2 hours with a report that Field Marshal Horn, with Swedish troops from Stettin, had joined Kniphausen and Hepburn and was guarding the passage between the enemy and Coburg. 2 days later, a message came to the effect that the Scottish Lord Reay had arrived, and that Nigel Graham's company was to march and join him. Monroe, with the rest of his command, was to continue to hold the castle, which was known as the Castle of Schiefelbrunne. Shortly afterwards, General Bauditzen arrived with 4,000 men and 18 pieces of cannon to press the siege of Coburg, which was one of the strongest fortresses in North Germany. On the 13th of November, news arrived that an enemy force was advancing to raise the siege, and Lord Reay with his half-regiment, Hepburn with half his regiment, and a regiment of Swedish infantry marched out to meet them, Kniphausen in command. They took up a position in a little village a few miles from the town, and here, at 4 o'clock in the morning, they were attacked by the Imperialists, 7,000 strong. The Swedish infantry fled, almost without firing a shot, but the Scottish musketeers of Hepburn and Reay stood their ground. For a time, a desperate conflict raged. In the darkness, it was utterly impossible to distinguish friend from foe, and numbers on both sides were mown down by the volleys of their own party. In the streets and gardens of the little village, men fought desperately with pikes and clubbed muskets. Unable to act in the darkness, and losing many men from the storm of bullets which swept over the village, the Swedish cavalry who had accompanied the column turned and fled. And being unable to resist so vast a superiority of force, Kniphausen gave the word, and the Scots fell slowly back under cover of the heavy mist which rose with the first breath of day, leaving 500 men, nearly half their force, dead behind them. Nigel Graham's company had suffered severely, and he himself was badly wounded. A lieutenant and one of the ensigns were killed, with 30 of the men, and many others were wounded with pike or bullet. Malcolm had had his share of the fighting. Several times he and the men immediately around him had been charged by the Imperialists, but their long pikes had each time repulsed the assaults. Malcolm had come to the conclusion that the first quality of an officer is coolness, and that this is even more valuable than reckless bravery. He had, therefore, set before himself that his first duty in action was to be perfectly calm, to speak without hurry or excitement, in a quiet and natural tone. In his first fight, the fight at Schiefelbrunne, he had endeavored to carry this out, but although he gained much commendation from Nigel and the other officers of the company for his coolness, he had by no means satisfied himself. Upon the present occasion, he succeeded much better in keeping his natural feelings in check, forcing himself to speak in a quiet and deliberate way, without flurry or excitement. The effect had been excellent, and the soldiers, in talking over the affair next day, were loud in their praise of the conduct of the young ensign.
"The lad was as cool as an old soldier," one of the sergeants said, "just as the Austrian column was coming on for the third time, shouting and cheering and sending bullets in a hail. He says to me as quietly as if he was giving an order about his dinner, 'I think, Donald, it'd be as well to keep the men out of fire until the last moment. Someone might get hurt,' says he, 'afore the enemy get close enough to use pikes.' And then when they came close, he said, 'Now, Sergeant, 'tis time to move out and stop 'em.' When they came upon us, he was fighting with his half-pike with the best of us. And when the Austrians fell back and began to fire again, and we took shelter behind the houses, he walked about on the road, stooping down over those who'd fallen to see if all were killed. And finding two were alive, he calls out, 'Will one of you come and help me carry these men under shelter? They may get hit again if they remain here.' I went out to him, but I can tell you I did not like it, for the bullets were coming along in a shower. His helmet was knocked off by one, and one of the men we were carrying was struck by 2 more bullets and killed, and the lad seemed to mind it no more than if it had been a rainstorm in the hills at home. I thought when we left Nithsdale the captain was in the wrong to make so young a boy an officer, but I do not think so now. He'll make a great soldier, if he lives."
The defense of the Scots had been so stubborn, and so vigilant was the watch which the besiegers kept, that the Imperialists were at last obliged to draw off and leave Coburg to its fate. The place held out till the 26th of February, when the garrison surrendered and were allowed to march out with the honors of war, with pikes carried, colors flying, drums beating, and with their baggage, and 2 pieces of cannon loaded and ready for action. They were saluted by the Protestant army as they marched away to the nearest town held by the Austrians, and as they passed Schiefelbrunne, Monroe's command were drawn up and presented arms to the 1,500 men who had, for 3 months, resisted every attempt to capture Coburg by assault. Nigel Graham's wound was so severe he was obliged for a time to relinquish command of his company to Harris. As there had been 2 vacancies among the officers, Malcolm would naturally have been promoted to the duties of lieutenant, but at his request his uncle chose for the purpose a young gentleman who had much distinguished himself in both the contests. 2 others were also promoted to fill up the vacancies as ensigns. The troops, after the capture of Coburg, marched to Stettin, around which town they encamped for a time, while Gustavus completed his preparations for his march into Germany. While a portion of his army had been besieging Coburg, Gustavus had been driving the Imperialists out of the whole of Pomerania. Landing on the 24th of June with an army of 15,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and about 3,000 artillery, Gustavus had, after dispatching troops to aid Monroe and besiege Coburg, marched against the Imperialists under Conti. These, however, retreated in great disorder, and with much loss of men, guns, and baggage, into Brandenburg. A few weeks after the Swedish landing, only Coburg, Griswold, and Deming held out. In January, Gustavus concluded a treaty with France, who agreed to pay him an annual subsidy of 400,000 thalers on the condition that Gustavus maintained in the field an army of 30,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, and would assure to the princes and peoples whose territory he might occupy the free exercise of their religion. England also promised a subsidy, and the Marquis of Hamilton was to bring over 6,000 infantry. But as King James did not wish openly to take part in the war, this force was not to appear as an English contingent. Many other regiments and parties of Scots were brought over by gentlemen of rank. 4 chosen Scottish regiments were formed into one brigade under the command of Hepburn. It was called the Green Brigade, and the doublets, scarfs, feathers, and standards were of that color. The rest of the infantry were divided into the yellow, blue, and white brigades.
One evening, when the officers of Ray's regiment were sitting round the campfire, Lieutenant Farquhar said to Colonel Munro, "How is it that Sir John Hepburn has, although still so young, risen to such high honour in the council of the king? The first feat in which he distinguished himself in the service of Sweden was at the relief of a town in eastern Prussia, which was blockaded by King Sigismund at the head of 30,000 Poles. The town is situated at the confluence of the Bersa River with the Vistula, which washes two sides of its walls. In front of the other face is a steep green eminence which the Poles had very strongly entrenched, and they had erected upon it 10 batteries of heavy cannon. As the town could only be approached on that side, the difficulties of the relieving force were enormous. But as the relief of the town was a necessity, in order to enable Gustavus to carry out the campaign he intended, the king determined to make a desperate effort to effect it. He selected 3,000 of his best Scottish infantry, among whom was Hepburn's own regiment, and 500 horse under Colonel Thurn. When they were drawn up, he gave them a short address on the desperate nature of the service they were about to perform, namely, to cut a passage over a strongly fortified hill defended by 30,000 men. Commanded by Hepburn, the column started at dusk. Unseen by the enemy, they approached their position and, working round it, began to ascend the hill by a narrow, winding path encumbered by rocks and stones, thick underwood, and overhanging trees. The difficulty for troops with heavy muskets, cartridges, breastplates, and helmets to make their way up such a place was enormous. And the mountainside was so steep they were frequently obliged to haul themselves up by the branches of trees. They managed to make their way through the enemy's outposts unobserved, and they reached the summit, where the ground was smooth and level. Here they fell at once upon the Poles, who were working busily at their trenches, and for a time gained a footing there. But a deadly fire of musketry, with showers of arrows and stones, opened upon them from all points, and this compelled the Scots to recoil from the trenches, where they were instantly attacked by crowds of horsemen in mail shirts and steel caps. Hepburn drew off his men till they reached a rock on the plateau, and here they made their stand, the musketeers occupying the rock, the pikemen forming in a wall around it. And this force, for 2 days, withstood the attacks of the whole of the Polish army. Now, while this desperate strife was going on, and the attention of the enemy entirely occupied, Gustavus managed to pass a strong force of men and a store of ammunition into the town, and the Poles, seeing that he'd achieved his purpose, retired unmolested. In every battle which Gustavus fought, Hepburn bore a prominent part. He distinguished himself at the storming of Kesmark and the defeat of the Poles who were marching to its relief. He took part in the siege and capture of Marienburg and the defeat of the Poles at Derschau. He was with Leslie when he defended Stralsund against Wallenstein and inflicted upon that mighty general the first reverse he'd ever met with. So truly, Hepburn has won his honours with the edge of the sword." Then Lieutenant Farquhar asked Colonel Munro, "Wallenstein is the greatest of the imperial generals, is he not?" "He and Tilly," Munro replied. "'Tis a question which is the greatest. They are men of a very different stamp. Tilly is a soldier, and nothing but a soldier, save that he's a fanatic in religion. He is as cruel as he is brave, and as portentously ugly as he is cruel." In saying all this, Colonel Munro was doing no less than justice to General Tilly. Even his enemies admitted his supreme personal courage under fire. Even his allies were sometimes stunned by his cruelty to captured foes. And as for his personal appearance, Tilly was short in stature, lean in figure. He had hollow cheeks, a long nose, a broad wrinkled forehead, heavy mustaches, and a sharp-pointed chin. He had from his boyhood been fighting against Protestants. He had learned the art of war under the cruel and pitiless Spanish general Alva in the Netherlands, of which country he was a native, and had afterwards fought against them in Bavaria, Bohemia, and the Palatinate, and had served in Hungary against the Turks. But Munro went on, "Wallenstein's a very different man. He has enormous ambition and great talent, and his possessions are so vast he's a dangerous subject for any potentate. even the most powerful. Curiously enough, he was born of Protestant parents, but when they died, he was committed to the care of his uncle, a Jesuit, and was by him brought up a strict Catholic. When he'd finished the course of his study at Metz, he spent some time at the University of Altdorf, and then studied at Bologna and Padua. He then traveled in Italy, Germany, France, Spain, England, and Holland, studying the military forces and tactics of each country. On Wallenstein's return to Bohemia, he took service under the Emperor Rudolf and joined the army of General Basta in Hungary, where he distinguished himself greatly. When peace came in 1606, Wallenstein returned to Bohemia, and though he was but 23 years old, he married a wealthy old widow, all of whose large properties came to him at her death 8 years after. 5 years later, he raised, at his own cost, 200 dragoons to support Ferdinand of Graz in his war against the Venetians. Here he greatly distinguished himself and was promoted to colonel. He married a second time, again to one of the richest heiresses of Austria. In 1618, on the outbreak of the current religious war, he raised the regiment of cuirassiers and fought at its head. 2 years later, he was made quartermaster general of the army and marched at the head of an independent force into Moravia, and there re-established imperial authority. The next year, he bought from the Emperor Ferdinand for a little over 7 million florins, 60 properties which the emperor had confiscated from Protestants whom he'd either executed or banished. Wallenstein had been made a count at the time of his second marriage. Now he was named Duke of Friedland. They say his wealth is so vast, he obtains 2.5 millions sterling a year from his various estates. In 1625, when King Christian of Denmark joined in the war against the emperor, Wallenstein raised at his own cost 50,000 men and defeated Mansfeld's army. After that, he cleared the Danes out of Silesia, conquered Brandenburg and Mecklenburg, and laid siege to Stralsund. At present, he's in retirement. The conquests which his army have made for the emperor aroused the suspicion and jealousy of the German princes, and it may be that the emperor himself was glad enough of an excuse to humble his too powerful subject. At any rate, Wallenstein's army was disbanded, and he retired to one of his castles. You may be sure we shall hear of him again. New Brandenburg and several other towns were captured and strongly garrisoned, 600 of Ray's regiment being left in New Brandenburg. Nigel Graham was still laid up, but his company formed part of the force. "This is ill fortune indeed," Malcolm said to Lieutenant Farquhar, "to be shut up here while the army are marching away to win victories in the field." "It is indeed. I suppose that the king thinks Tilly is likely to try and retake these places, and so threaten his rear guard as he marches forward. He would never have placed as strong a force of his best soldiers here if he had not thought the position a very important one." The troops were quartered in the larger buildings of New Brandenburg. The officers were billeted upon the burghers. The position of the country people and the inhabitants of the towns of Germany during this long, desolating war was terrible. No matter which side won, they suffered. There were in those days no commissariat wagons bringing up stores from depots and magazines to the armies. The troops lived entirely upon the country through which they marched. In exceptional cases, when the military chest happened to be well filled, the provisions acquired might be paid for. But as a rule, armies upon the march lived by foraging. The cavalry swept in the flocks and herds from the country round. Flour, forage, and everything else required was seized wherever found, and the unhappy peasants and villagers thought themselves lucky if they escaped with the loss of all they possessed without violence, insult, or ill treatment. The slightest resistance to the exactions of the lawless foragers excited their fury, and indiscriminate slaughter took place. The march of an army could be followed by burned villages, demolished houses, crops destroyed, and general ruin and desolation. The towns generally escaped indiscriminate plunder by sending deputies forward to meet advancing armies, when an offer would be made to the general to supply so much food and so much money on condition that private property was respected. In these cases, the main body of the troops was generally encamped outside the town. Along the routes frequently followed by armies, the country became a desert. The hapless people forsook their ruined homes and took refuge in the forests or hills, carrying with them their portable property and driving before them a cow or two and a few goats. How great was the general slaughter and destruction may be judged by the fact that the population of Germany decreased by half during the war. And in Bohemia, the slaughter was even greater. At the commencement of the war, the population of Bohemia consisted of 3 million people in 35,000 villages. At the end of the war, there were but 780,000 inhabitants and 6,000 villages. 3 out of 4 of the whole population had been slaughtered during the struggle. With Lieutenant Farquhar, Malcolm was quartered upon one of the principal burghers of New Brandenburg, a syndic of the weavers. He received them cordially. "I am glad to entertain 2 Scottish officers. Frankly, your presence will be of no slight advantage, for it is only the houses where officers are quartered which can hope to escape from the plunder and exactions of the soldiers. My wife and I will do our best to make you comfortable, but we cannot entertain you as we could have done before the war began, for trade is altogether ruined. None have money to buy goods. Even when free from the presence of contending armies, the country is infested with parties of deserters or disbanded soldiers who plunder and murder all whom they meet, so that none dare travel along the roads, save in strong parties. There is scarce a village standing within 20 miles, and many parts have suffered much more than we have. If this war goes on, God help the people." The burgher led them into a low sitting room, where his wife and 3 daughters were at work. They started up with looks of alarm at the clatter of steel in the hall. "Wife," the syndic said as he entered, "these 2 gentlemen are officers of the Scottish regiment. They will stay with us during the occupation of the town. I know that you and the girls will do your best to make their stay pleasant to them." As the officers removed their helmets, the apprehensions of the women calmed down on perceiving that one of their guests was a young man of 3 or 4 and 20, while the other was a lad, and that both had bright, pleasant faces, in no way answering the terrible reputation gained by the invincible soldiers of the Swedish king. "I hope," Farquhar said pleasantly, "that you will not put yourselves out of your way for us. We are soldiers of fortune, accustomed to sleeping on the ground and living on the roughest fare, and since leaving Scotland we have scarcely slept beneath a roof. We will be as little trouble to you as we can, and our 2 soldier servants will do all that we need." Farquhar spoke to them in German, for so large a number of Germans were serving among the Swedes that the Scottish officers had learned to speak that language, and Swedish, German being absolutely necessary for their intercourse with the country people. This was the more easy, as the 2 languages were akin to each other, and less broadly separated from English in those days than they are now. It was now nearly a year since Farquhar and Malcolm had landed on the shores of the Baltic, and they'd had no difficulty learning to speak both German and Swedish fluently. Chapter 4. New Brandenburg. Farquhar and Malcolm Graham were soon at home with their hosts. The syndic had offered to have their meals prepared for them in a separate chamber, but they begged to be allowed to take them with the family, with whom they speedily became intimate. 3 weeks after the capture of New Brandenburg, the news came that Tilly, with a large army, was rapidly approaching. Every effort was made to place the town in a position of defense. Day after day, messengers came in with the news that the other places which had been garrisoned by the Swedes had been captured, and very shortly, the imperialist army was seen approaching. The garrison knew that they could expect no relief from Gustavus, who had 10 days before marched northward. All prepared for a desperate resistance. The townsfolk looked on with trembling apprehension. They knew that, should the city be taken, the property of the townspeople was regarded by the soldiery as their lawful prize, whether friendly to the conquerors or the reverse. The town was at once summoned to surrender, and upon Lindsay's refusal, the siege began. As Tilly was anxious to march away to the north to oppose Gustavus, he spared no effort to reduce New Brandenburg as speedily as possible, and his artillery fired night and day to effect breaches in the walls. The Scotch officers saw little of their hosts now, for they were almost continually upon the walls. At the first news of the approach of the Imperialists, the Syndic had sent away his daughters to the house of a relative at Stralsund, where his son was in business. When Farquhar and Malcolm returned to eat a meal, or to throw themselves on their beds to snatch a short sleep, the Syndic anxiously questioned them as to the progress of the siege. The reports were not hopeful. In several places, the walls were crumbling, and it was probable that a storm would shortly be attempted. The town itself was suffering heavily, for the balls of the besiegers frequently flew high and came crashing among the houses. Few of the inhabitants were to be seen in the streets. All had buried their most valuable property, and with scared faces awaited the issue of the conflict. After 6 days' cannonade, the walls were breached in many places, and the Imperialists advanced to the assault. The Scotch defended them with great resolution, and again the Imperialists recoiled, unable to burst their way through the lines of pikes or to withstand the heavy musketry fire poured upon them from the walls and buildings. But Tilly's army was so strong, he was able continually to bring up fresh troops to the attack, while the Scots were incessantly engaged. For 48 hours, the defenders resisted successfully, but at last, worn out by fatigue, they were unable to withstand the onslaught of the enemy, and the latter forced their way into the town. Still the Scots fought on. Falling back, they contested every foot of the ground, holding the streets and lanes with desperate tenacity and inflicting terrible losses upon the enemy. At last, 12 hours later, they were gathered in the marketplace, nearly in the center of the town, surrounded on all sides by the enemy. Several times the Scottish bugles had sounded a parley, but Tilly, furious at the resistance and at the loss which the capture of the town had entailed, had issued orders that no quarter should be given. His troops pressed the now diminished band of Scotchmen on all sides. Even now they could not break through the circle of spears, but from every window and roof commanding them, a deadly fire was poured in. Colonel Lindsay was shot dead. Captain Moncrief and Farquhar fell close to Malcolm. The shouts of "No quarter!" rose from the masses of Imperialists. Parties of the Scotch, preferring to die sword in hand rather than be shot down, flung themselves into the midst of the enemy and died fighting. At last, when but 50 men remained standing, these, in a close body, rushed at the enemy and drove them by the fury of their attack some distance down the principal street. Then numbers told. The band was broken up, and a desperate hand-to-hand conflict raged for a time. 2 of the Scottish officers alone succeeded in breaking their way down a side lane and, rushing to the wall, leaped down into the moat. Swimming across, they succeeded in making their escape and in carrying the news of the massacre to the camp of Gustavus, where the tale filled all with indignation and fury. Among the Scotch regiments, deep vows of vengeance were interchanged, and in after battles, the Imperialists had cause bitterly to rue having refused quarter to the Scots at New Brandenburg. When the last melee was at its thickest, and all hope at an end, Malcolm, who had been fighting desperately with his half-pike, found himself for a moment in a doorway. He turned the handle, and it opened. The house, like all the others, was full of Imperialists who had thrown themselves into it when the Scots made their charge, and were now keeping up a fire at them from the upper windows. Closing the door behind him, Malcolm stood for a moment to recover his breath. He had passed unscathed through the 3 days' fighting, though his armor and helmet were deeply dented in many places. The din without and above was tremendous. The stroke of sword on armor, the sharp crack of the pistols, the rattle of musketry, the shouts of the Imperialists, and the wild, defiant cries of the Highlanders mingled together. As Malcolm stood panting, he recalled that the Syndic's house was in the street behind. He determined to gain it, feeling sure that his host would shelter him if he could. Passing through the house, he issued into a courtyard and quickly stripped off his armor and accoutrements. Climbing upon the wall, he ran along it until behind the house of the Syndic, and dropped into the courtyard. The latter and his wife gave a cry of astonishment as the lad entered the house, breathless and pale as death. "Can you shelter me a while? I believe that all my countrymen are killed." "We will do our best," the syndic said at once. "But the houses will be ransacked presently, from top to bottom." "Let him have one of the servants' outfits," the wife said. "They can all be trusted." One of the serving men was at once called in, and he hurried off with Malcolm. The Scotsmen had made themselves very popular with the servants by their courtesy and care to avoid giving unnecessary trouble, and in a few minutes Malcolm was attired as a serving man and joined the servants who were busy in spreading the tables with provisions and in broaching a large cask of wine to allay the passions of the Imperialists. It was not long before they came. There was a thundering knocking at the door, and upon its being opened, a number of soldiers burst in. All bore signs of the desperate strife in which they had been engaged. "You are welcome," the host said. "I have made preparations for your coming. Eat and drink as it pleases you." Rushing to the wine casks, the soldiers appeased their thirst with long draughts of wine, and then fell upon the eatables. Other bands followed, and the house was soon filled from top to bottom with soldiers who ransacked the cupboards, loaded themselves with such things as they deemed worth carrying away, and wantonly broke and destroyed what they could not. The servants were all kept busy bringing up wine from the cellars. This was of good quality, and the soldiers, well satisfied, abstained from personal violence. All night long, pandemonium reigned in the town. Flames broke out in many places. Whole streets were burned. But in the morning, a fresh party marched into the town. These collected the stragglers and seized all the horses and carts for the carriage of the baggage and plunder. The burgomaster had been taken before Tilly and commanded to find a considerable sum of money first thing in the morning, under threat that the whole town would be burned down and the inhabitants massacred if it was not forthcoming. A council of the principal inhabitants was hastily summoned at daybreak. The syndics of the various guilds between them contributed the necessary sum either in money or in drafts, and at noon Tilly marched away with his troops, leaving the smoking and ruined town behind. Many of the inhabitants were forced as drivers to accompany the horses and carts taken away, Malcolm being one of the number. It was well that the Pomeranian dialect differed widely from the Bavarian, so Malcolm's German had consequently passed muster without suspicion. The Imperialist army, although dragging with them an immense train of carts laden with plunder, marched rapidly. The baggage was guarded by horsemen who kept the train in motion, galloping up and down the line, and freely administering blows among their captives whenever a delay or stoppage occurred. The whole country through which they passed was desolated and wasted. The army would have fared badly had it not been for the herds of captured cattle they drove along with them, and the wagons laden with flour and wine taken at New Brandenburg and the other towns they had stormed. The marches were long, for Tilly was anxious to accomplish his object before Gustavus should be aware of the direction he was taking. This object was the capture of the town of Magdeburg, a large and important city and one of the strongholds of Protestantism. Here Tilly was resolved to strike a blow which would, he believed, terrify Germany into submission. When Gustavus heard that Tilly had marched west, he moved against Frankfurt on the Oder, where the Imperialists were commanded by Count Schomberg. The latter had taken every measure for the defense of the town, destroying all the suburbs, burning the country houses and mills, and cutting down the orchards and vineyards. Gustavus, accompanied by Sir John Hepburn, at once reconnoitered the place and posted his troops. As the Swedes advanced, the Imperialist garrison, who were 10,000 strong, opened fire with musketry and cannon from the walls. The weakest point in the defense was assigned by Schomberg to Colonel Walter Butler, who commanded a regiment of Irish musketeers in the Imperialist service. In the evening, Hepburn and some other officers accompanied the king to reconnoiter near the walls. A party of Imperialists, seeing officers approaching and, judging by their waving plumes that they were of importance, sallied quietly out of a postern gate unperceived and suddenly opened fire. A body of Hepburn's regiment rushed forward and drove in the Imperialists, a lieutenant colonel and a captain being captured.
So hotly did they press the Imperialists that they were able to make a lodgment on some high ground of the rampart, on which stood an old churchyard surrounded by a wall, and whence their fire could sweep the enemy's works. Cannon were at once brought up and placed in position here, and opened fire on the nearest gate. The next day all was ready for the assault. It was Palm Sunday, and the attack was to take place at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The Green Brigade were to head the assault, and Gustavus, addressing them, bade them remember New Brandenburg. At 5 o'clock, a tremendous cannonade was opened on the walls from all the Swedish batteries. Under cover of the smoke, the Green Brigade advanced to the assault. From the circle of the walls, a cloud of smoke and fire broke out from cannon and arquebus, muskets and wall pieces. Sir John Hepburn and Colonel Lumsden, side by side, led on their regiments against the gate. In spite of the tremendous fire poured upon them from the wall, they reached the gate, and the two colonels fixed petards to it and retired a few paces. In a minute, there was a tremendous explosion, and the gate fell in fragments. The Scottish pikemen rushed forward. As they did so, there was a roar of cannon, and a storm of bullets plowed lanes through the close ranks of the pikemen, for the Imperialists, expecting the attack, had placed cannon, loaded to the muzzle with bullets, behind the gates. Monro's regiment now leaped into the moat, waded across, and, planting their ladders under murderous fire, stormed the works flanking the gate, then joined their comrades who were striving to make an entrance. Hepburn, leading on the pikemen, was hit in the knee, where he had in a former battle been badly wounded. "Go on, Monro," he said. "I am wounded." A major who advanced to take his place at the head of the regiment was shot dead, and so terrible was the fire that even the pikemen of Hepburn's regiment wavered for a moment. But Monro and Lumsden, with their visors down and half-pikes in their hands, cheered on their men, and, side by side, led the way. "Advance, pikes!" shouted Lumsden. "Forward!" shouted Monro. With a wild cheer, the Scots burst forward. The gates were stormed, and in a moment the cannon, being seized, were turned, and volleys of bullets poured upon the dense masses of the Imperialists. The pikemen pressed forward in close column, shoulder to shoulder, pikes leveled in front, the musketeers behind firing on the Imperialists in the houses. In the meantime, Gustavus, with the blue and yellow Swedish brigades, stormed that part of the wall defended by Butler and his Irishmen, the White Brigade storming the wall in another quarter. Twice the Imperialist drums beat a parley, but their sound was deadened by the roar of musketry and the boom of cannon and the uproar and shouting in every street and house. The Green Brigade, under its commander, maintained its regular order, pressing forward with resistless strength. In vain the Austrians shouted for quarter. They were met by shouts of, "Remember New Brandenburg!" Even now, when all was lost, Tilly's veterans fought with extreme bravery and resolution. But at last, all resistance ceased. 4 colonels, 36 officers, and 3,000 men were killed. 50 colors and 10 baggage wagons laden with gold and silver plate were captured. Many were taken prisoner, and hundreds were drowned in the river Oder, across which the survivors of the garrison made their escape. Plundering at once began, and several houses were set on fire. But Gustavus ordered the drums to beat and the soldiers to repair to their colors outside the town, which was committed to the charge of Sir John Hepburn with his regiment. Meanwhile, the rumor that Magdeburg was the next object of attack had circulated among Tilly's troops the day after they marched west from New Brandenburg. It originated in some chance word dropped by a superior officer, and seemed confirmed by the direction which they were taking, directly away from the Swedish army. There was a report, too, that Count Pappenheim, who commanded a separate army, would meet Tilly there, and that every effort would be made to capture the town before Gustavus could march to its assistance. Malcolm could easily have made his escape the first night after leaving New Brandenburg, but the distance to be traversed to join the Swedish army was great. Confusion and disorder reigned everywhere, and he had decided that it would be safer to remain with the Imperialist army until Gustavus should approach within striking distance. However,
As soon as Malcolm heard the report of Tilly's intentions, he saw that it was of the utmost importance that the King of Sweden should be informed of the imperialist plans. He determined to endeavor to make his way across the country. At nightfall, the train with the baggage and plunder was, as usual, so placed that it was surrounded by the camps of the various brigades of the army in order to prevent desertion. The previous night, an escape would have been comparatively easy, for the soldiers were worn out by their exertions at the siege of New Brandenburg, and still heavy from the drink they had obtained there. But discipline was now restored, and the sentries were alert. A close cordon of these was placed round the baggage train, and when this was passed, there would still be the difficulty of escaping through the camps of soldiery and passing the outposts. Malcolm waited until the camp became comparatively quiet, for the supplies of wine were far from exhausted, and reveling was still going on in various parts of the camp. The night was fine and bright, and Malcolm saw that it would be difficult to get through the line of sentries who were stationed some 30 or 40 yards apart. After thinking for some time, he went up to a group of 8 or 10 horses which were fastened by their bridles to a large store wagon outside the baggage camp. Malcolm unfastened the bridles and turned the horses' heads outwards. Then he gave 2 of them a sharp prick with his dagger, and the startled animals dashed forward in fright, followed by their companions. They passed close to one of the sentries, who tried in vain to stop them, and then burst into the camp beyond, where their rush startled the horses picketed there. These began to kick and struggle desperately to free themselves from their fastenings. The soldiers, startled at the noise, sprang to their feet, and much confusion reigned until the runaway horses were secured and driven back to their lines. The instant he had thus diverted the attention of the whole line of sentries along that side of the camp, Malcolm crept quietly up and passed between them. Turning from the direction in which the horses had disturbed the camp, he made his way cautiously along. Only the officers had tents, the men sleeping on the ground around their fires. He had to move with the greatest caution to avoid treading upon the sleepers, and was constantly compelled to make detours to get beyond the range of the fires, round which groups of men were sitting and carousing. At last he reached the outside of the camp, and taking advantage of every clump of bushes, had no difficulty in making his way through the outposts, and by morning was 15 miles from Tilly's camp. Entering a wood, he threw himself down and slept soundly for some hours, and it was nearly noon before he started again.